History remembers wars by their visible scars: bombed-out cities, burned landscapes, parades of victory, and the treaties that close official chapters. Yet the most unsettling truths of the Second World War were never meant to be written into history books. They exist only in fragments, faded ink on yellowing paper, intercepted transmissions scribbled in the margins of intelligence reports, testimonies whispered under duress in interrogation chambers, and files stamped most secret buried deep within locked archives. These stories, long hidden, suggest that the war was not simply fought on battlefields, but also in boardrooms, embassies, and smoke-filled safe houses, where deals of survival were struck behind closed doors. These are accounts that unravel the sanitized version of the past, exposing conspiracies that powerful governments preferred to suppress. Each revelation, recovered from declassified Soviet dossiers, Gestapo file fragments, or British cabinet records marked for destruction, unveils a darker undercurrent to the so-called Good War. They speak of secret pacts with neutral states, shadow projects experimenting with forbidden technologies, devastating military operations executed as geopolitical warnings rather than strategic necessity, and covert prisoner exchanges designed to trade human lives for technological supremacy. The following chapters explore 4 suppressed truths, each drawn from evidence too volatile to appear in official history. They do not flatter the victors, nor do they absolve the defeated. Instead, they confront us with an uncomfortable reality that in war, survival often takes precedence over morality, and what remains hidden may alter how we understand the very foundations of the modern world. Chapter 1. The Hidden Pact of Madrid, 1943. In the winter of 1943, Madrid was a city draped in shadows. Spain had declared itself neutral, yet neutrality in Francisco Franco's Spain was always negotiable. Allied agents described the city as a nest of shifting allegiances, where German attachés, British operatives, Soviet spies, and opportunistic intermediaries filled the cafes and corridors of embassies. Among the city's most closely guarded secrets was a set of clandestine meetings that would later be whispered of in OSS files, under the codename Protocol Schatten. What these meetings revealed was not neutrality at all, but a calculated pact between remnants of the Nazi hierarchy and the Spanish, our state, a pact designed not to win the war, but to ensure the Reich's survival long after the smoke of Berlin cleared. The story emerges not from Allied triumphalism, but from scattered fragments, diplomatic, cables intercepted by the Office of Strategic Services, Soviet intelligence memoranda marked ultra-secret, and a series of Gestapo reports filed under number 201A. Together, they describe a series of negotiations that began in December 1943, as Axis defeat became a question of time, not possibility. SS General Karl Wolff, operating under directives from Heinrich Himmler, dispatched envoys across the Pyrenees disguised as agricultural inspectors. Their mission was to establish escape routes through the mountain passes into Spain, and from there, into neutral territories, and ultimately South America. Gold extracted from the Reichsbank's reserves was offered as collateral, funneled through Spanish banks like Banco Alemán Transatlántico, and concealed beneath layers of false corporate ownership. At the heart of this conspiracy was Franco's Spain, eager to maintain the illusion of independence while extracting tangible rewards from the Reich's desperation. Spanish carabineros were ordered to turn a blind eye to movements across the Pyrenees. Vatican-issued documents, the so-called rat lines, were distributed through Spanish churches in Burgos and Pamplona, offering Nazi officials new identities. Gestapo couriers recorded these operations with unnerving precision. False passports stamped in Lisbon, safe houses arranged in Barcelona, and maritime passages coordinated from Cadiz to Buenos Aires. One report even details Luftwaffe pilots hidden among agricultural laborers in Aragon, waiting for their eventual relocation overseas. For decades, British archives held fragments of intercepted communications regarding these routes, but full disclosure was carefully avoided. Declassified fragments from file HS 9432 confirm that London knew of the Madrid channels, but concealed the depth of collaboration, fearing public backlash if Allied populations learned of Spain's double dealings. More chillingly, Soviet archives reveal that Stalin's NKVD also monitored these transactions, yet chose silence, preferring to exploit knowledge of Spain's complicity during Cold War negotiations. The secrecy was not born of ignorance, it was born of convenience. For all sides, truth was expendable when it served larger strategic interests. The gold shipments themselves remain a central piece of the puzzle. Declassified Bank of England records mention shadow deposits arriving through Swiss intermediaries in late 1944, linked to Spanish accounts swollen beyond any wartime trade justification. Estimates suggest that nearly 400 tons of Reich gold were transferred westward, much of it suspected to have originated from confiscated assets in occupied Europe. Spanish officials denied knowledge, yet Gestapo file no. 20A clearly outlines strategic displacement plans funded by these transfers. The purpose was never simple escape, it was preservation. The Reich would not survive in Germany, but fragments of it would endure elsewhere, funded, sheltered, and disguised. Evidence of the South American connection surfaced after the war in Argentine intelligence reports reluctantly handed over to Allied investigators. Buenos Aires became a hub for arriving businessmen whose pasts were carefully obscured. The Perón government, sympathetic to remnants of the Axis, facilitated their integration into Argentina's military and industrial sectors. What Allied investigators never publicly acknowledged was the Madrid-Buenos Aires pipeline. Operation Shatten had laid the groundwork for an enduring network, extending Nazi influence far beyond 1945. The Vatican's role remains one of the most controversial threads. While officially neutral, Vatican channels were repeatedly implicated in issuing identity documents under humanitarian pretenses. Priests and bishops sympathetic to anti-communist causes facilitated travel under new names. One OSS report describes a convoy of former SS officers leaving Madrid with Vatican-provided papers, boarding a ship in Valencia under false designations as missionaries. These cases were never prosecuted. Their exposure would have damaged fragile post-war alliances and undermined the Church's standing during an era when anti-communism overshadowed wartime complicity. The Allies' silence was strategic. Britain needed Franco's cooperation to prevent Spain from joining the Axis formally, and later to secure Mediterranean stability during the Cold War. The United States, eager to counter Soviet influence, turned a blind eye to Spain's wartime deals, reintegrating the regime into Western alliances by the 1950s. By then, the Madrid Pact had already achieved its purpose. Hundreds of Nazi officials, industrialists, and scientists had escaped justice, their trails vanishing into South American cities and Middle Eastern protectorates. The war may have ended, but the Reich's shadow survived, camouflaged by the very allies who claimed victory. The most chilling aspect of the Madrid Pact is not its secrecy, but its implications. History often depicts the Nazi collapse as absolute, a regime destroyed at Nuremberg and extinguished in Berlin's ruins. Yet the archival fragments tell a different story. That survival was engineered with cold precision, negotiated in quiet hotel rooms on Madrid's Gran Via, financed with stolen wealth, and sanctioned by powers too pragmatic to interfere. For those who escaped, justice was never blind. It was simply bypassed. For decades, the Madrid Pact remained hidden, buried in diplomatic archives marked, "Do not release without ministerial approval." It was not until Soviet files were opened in the 1990s that researchers began piecing together its full scope. Even then, much remains obscured, with key files redacted or missing entirely. What has emerged is unsettling, a web of complicity stretching across Europe, implicating not only Franco's Spain, but neutral Switzerland, the Vatican, and eventually Allied intelligence itself. The truth was never convenient, so it was simply left unspoken. The echoes of this secret deal reach far beyond 1943. Families of Holocaust victims discovered traces of their stolen assets in Spanish banks decades later, hidden behind false accounts. South American communities continue to unearth evidence of German enclaves seeded by wartime escapees, and historians still wrestle with the uncomfortable question: if the war was won so decisively, why were its perpetrators allowed to vanish so completely? The answer lies in Madrid, in the shadows of 1943, where survival was purchased with gold and silence was the true currency of war. This is not the war remembered in monuments or taught in textbooks. It is the war preserved in the margins of intelligence reports, where blurred ink and vanished files tell a darker story, a story of a pact made not for victory, but for survival, ensuring that the Reich, though defeated, would never truly disappear. Chapter 2: Operation Black Mercury in the Urals. In the frozen expanses of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of Western reporters and even beyond the eyes of most Soviet generals, a secret unfolded that would later be buried beneath layers of censorship and silence, known within NKVD memoranda as Project Chernaya Rtut, Operation Black Mercury. It represented one of the most forbidden undertakings of the Second World War. It was not a conventional weapons program, nor a traditional military operation. Instead, it sought to weaponize something more elusive, something hidden beneath the ancient rocks of Sverdlovsk and Chelyabinsk. Rare isotopes mined in secrecy, transported in sealed convoys, and guarded as if they were treasures from another world. The Soviet Union officially denied its existence. Western historians dismissed the few rumors that escaped as Cold War disinformation, yet declassified fragments, survivor testimonies, and recently unearthed Polish underground accounts reveal an unsettling truth: that entire camps of forced laborers vanished, that radiation-scorched ledgers survived where people did not, and that the Soviets abandoned the project not out of failure, but out of fear. The origins of Operation Black Mercury can be traced to the summer of 1942, when the Red Army faced catastrophe on the Eastern Front. German advances threatened Moscow, and Soviet leadership sought any technological edge to shift the tide of war. In July, Stalin authorized a classified directive, numbered 247 VOM, ordering the NKVD to exploit non-conventional resources for strategic development. Unlike the atomic program in the United States, which openly recruited the world's leading scientists, the Soviet approach operated in silence, concealed even from much of its own government. Geologists under military escort were dispatched to the Urals, where whispers of unusual deposits, unrecorded in public geological surveys, had circulated since Tsarist times. These were said to emit a metallic shimmer, toxic to touch, yet capable of releasing extraordinary energy when refined. Convoys began moving in late 1942. American and British intelligence intercepted German Abwehr reports that described trains leaving Sverdlovsk under armed escort, carrying sealed caskets wrapped in lead. Enigma decrypts, stored in Allied archives under the designation HW 190274, hinted that the Germans knew of something far beyond conventional ore. One Abwehr officer noted that the cargo burns without flame, a phrase that mystified Allied analysts at the time. In London, codebreakers filed the reports without context, unable to determine whether they referred to a weapon, an experiment, or simply misinformation. Only decades later did researchers link these messages to the vanished convoys of the Urals. The labor that sustained the project came not from volunteers, but from prisoners. Gulag camps in Vorkuta and Norilsk were emptied of inmates, their populations transferred south under the guise of industrial relocation. Survivors who later spoke in hushed tones described arriving at camps near Chelyabinsk 40, a site that would later become infamous during the Cold War for its role in Soviet nuclear development. The conditions were lethal. Workers labored without protective gear, digging into luminous veins of ore that left burns on their skin. Entire camps reportedly disappeared overnight, their existence erased from Soviet records. Polish underground operatives, gathering scraps of intelligence from deported laborers, recorded testimonies of shining stones and dust that killed. These reports, smuggled to London in 1944, were dismissed by British analysts as exaggerated rumors from exhausted prisoners. Yet the consistency of the descriptions across multiple testimonies suggests otherwise. The NKVD controlled every aspect of the operation. Unlike the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which pursued nuclear research openly by 1943, Operation Black Mercury remained compartmentalized, its data restricted to Stalin's closest circle. Internal documents describe a facility referred to only as Complex 17, built deep in the forests east of Sverdlovsk. Here, scientists reportedly conducted experiments in sealed chambers, measuring radiation levels with improvised instruments. A declassified CIA assessment from 1952, based on interviews with defectors, suggested that Soviet scientists in Complex 17 experimented with liquid mercury infused with radioactive isotopes, seeking to create a new type of warhead. The precise nature of the experiments remains unknown, but the evidence of their failure lies in the landscape itself. Regions near Chelyabinsk still report heightened radiation levels, decades after the supposed end of the project. What makes Operation Black Mercury particularly disturbing is the silence that followed its collapse. Soviet archives contain almost no official record of its existence. Unlike the atomic program, celebrated later as a triumph of Soviet science, this project was deliberately erased. Documents were destroyed, personnel reassigned, and sites abandoned without explanation. Yet fragments of evidence escaped destruction. A ledger found in a Moscow archive in the 1990s, its pages scorched and warped, lists chemical samples marked RT7 and RT9, with annotations noting instability and fatal exposure. Another recovered file describes an accident in January 1944, when a containment breach allegedly killed an entire research team within hours. Their names were never recorded. The file simply notes, research staff replaced. The West, too, knew more than it admitted. Declassified OSS cables reveal discussions in Washington in 1944 about anomalous shipments from the Urals. A memo from Alan Dulles, later director of the CIA, noted that the Soviets appeared to be pursuing a parallel path to nuclear research with unknown results. Yet no action was taken. The Allies were content to let the Soviets exhaust their resources, perhaps hoping that failure would weaken them before the post-war era. After the war, captured German scientists confirmed that the Reich had monitored Soviet experiments closely. Abwehr File 72B, seized in Berlin, described substances that kill without explosion. The Germans never developed a similar program, but their awareness indicates that the Ural operations were no mere rumor. By 1945, Operation Black Mercury had effectively vanished. Stalin's focus shifted to the conventional nuclear program under Igor Kurchatov, which would eventually yield the Soviet bomb. The camps associated with Black Mercury were quietly disbanded, their survivors dispersed across the Gulag system. Local populations near the Ural sites, however, continued to report unexplained illnesses, hair loss, birth defects, strange fevers that persisted into the 1950s. These anomalies were never officially acknowledged, but they suggest lingering contamination from the abandoned experiments. The most haunting testimonies come from Polish survivors who returned home after the war. In interviews recorded secretly by the Polish underground in 1946, former prisoners described glowing barrels buried in pits, guarded by NKVD patrols. One recalled, "At night the ground itself seemed to breathe light. The guards told us never to approach, but some men did. They did not live more than a week." These testimonies, dismissed at the time as hallucinations, align disturbingly with modern knowledge of radiation sickness. They suggest that the Soviets stumbled upon forces they could not control, and in their attempt to weaponize them, sacrificed thousands in silence. To this day, the full truth of Operation Black Mercury remains obscured. Many of the sites associated with it are closed military zones. Maps from the era were altered, villages erased, and industrial plants mislabeled to conceal the locations. Attempts by Western researchers in the 1990s to access archives related to Complex 17 were denied, with Russian officials claiming no such facility existed. Yet satellite imagery of the Urals reveals vast abandoned compounds hidden in forests, their structures decaying, their ground scarred with unnatural discolorations. These ruins, silent and empty, may be all that remains of the forbidden project. The implications of Black Mercury are unsettling. If the Soviets were indeed experimenting with unstable isotopes years before the West developed the bomb, then the risk of catastrophic accident was immense. The lack of surviving documentation suggests deliberate purging, an effort not to conceal failure from the enemy, but to protect the Soviet state from its own history. The victims, prisoners, scientists, guards, were simply erased, their deaths unrecorded, their existence denied. The silence that followed was not ignorance, but design. Operation Black Mercury reminds us that war often pushes nations into realms they cannot control. For the Soviet Union, desperate in 1942 and 1943, even the most dangerous and unstable technologies were worth pursuing if they offered the possibility of survival. Yet what emerged was not salvation, but disaster. An experiment too dangerous to be remembered, too costly to admit, and too toxic to erase completely. The shadows of the Urals still carry its legacy, buried beneath the earth, sealed in forgotten barrels, and whispered in testimonies that governments tried to suppress. It is a chapter of the war that history was never meant to read, a secret too dangerous to survive in daylight. Chapter 3: Churchill's Lost Directive on Dresden. The ruins of Dresden remain one of the most haunting images of the Second World War. The city, once celebrated as the Florence on the Elbe, was reduced to ash in February 1945 by waves of Allied bombers. The official narrative frames the destruction as a military necessity, targeting German infrastructure and troop movements in support of Soviet advances. Yet buried deep within British archives, beneath layers of redaction and bureaucratic silence, lies evidence that suggests another purpose altogether. Among the fragments is a memorandum marked "Most Secret, War Cabinet Eyes Only," bearing the signature of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Though heavily censored, what remains reveals that the inferno unleashed on Dresden may not have been designed solely to cripple Germany. Instead, it was calculated as a signal, an unmistakable demonstration of Western air supremacy directed at Moscow, not Berlin. The directive itself first surfaced in whispers among researchers in the late 1970s, when fragments of RAF Group Bomber Command files were partially declassified. File Cab 120-303 contained references to Operation Thunderclap Extension, a code name linked to large-scale air raids against German cities in early 1945. The original plan, drawn up in 1944, proposed a massive bombardment intended to break German morale, but internal debates had scaled it back. What resurfaced in February 1945 was not the original thunderclap, but an extension, a focused act of devastation targeting a city of symbolic, not strategic, value. Dresden had little heavy industry, but it lay directly in the path of advancing Soviet troops. The destruction of the city, according to the directive, would serve as a visible demonstration of capability as negotiations over post-war Europe loomed. American generals were uneasy. Records from the US Army Air Forces reveal strong objections, particularly from General Ira C. Eaker, who questioned the necessity of targeting a cultural center with minimal military significance. In a memo preserved in US National Archives file RG 18276, Eaker wrote that such an operation will achieve no material gain commensurate with its human cost. Yet British Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command, pressed forward. Known as Bomber Harris for his unrelenting belief in strategic bombing, he insisted that the orders came from the highest level. His directive cited Churchill's memorandum, which described the need for an overwhelming demonstration to remind both friend and foe of British power. At the war's end, the attack unfolded on the nights of 13 and 14th of February 1945. Nearly 800 RAF bombers and over 300 American B-17s dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The result was a firestorm, temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Celsius, winds that sucked oxygen from the streets, and civilians incinerated where they stood. German records estimate 25,000 deaths, though some post-war accounts place the number far higher. The destruction shocked even those who carried it out. US crews reported nausea at the sight of the firestorm from above, a city of art reduced to molten ruin. Yet Bomber Command recorded the mission as a success, noting complete destruction of target area. Soviet reactions were muted at the time, but intelligence reports confirm that Moscow understood the true message. NKVD files declassified in the 1990s include intercepts of conversations among Soviet officials describing the raid as a warning to us, not the Germans. One Soviet officer remarked, "The West has shown us what it can do to any city, should it wish to." Stalin, outwardly silent, never forgot the demonstration. In later years, as Cold War tensions hardened, the memory of Dresden would become a quiet counterweight. In Moscow's strategic calculus, a reminder that the West was willing to obliterate civilian centers to achieve geopolitical ends. The Churchill memorandum itself remains controversial. The surviving fragment, preserved in Chab 120-303, states, "It is desirable to deliver a blow of such magnitude as to impress not only the enemy, but our allies, whose future designs may not align with our own." The wording is ambiguous, but its implication is unmistakable. Churchill himself later distanced from the raid, writing in March 1945 that the destruction of Dresden was a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Yet the sequence of orders suggests that he was complicit, at least in authorizing the mission's scale. His subsequent disavowal may have been an attempt to shield himself from public outrage once reports of the civilian toll emerged. The debate over Dresden has raged for decades, but the classified directive tilts the balance. If the raid was indeed conceived as a geopolitical message to the Soviets, It represents one of the earliest shots of the Cold War, delivered not in words, but in fire. It reframes the narrative of Allied unity, revealing fractures already visible before the war had even ended. The notion that a Western leader would sacrifice a city not to defeat Hitler, but to intimidate Stalin, forces us to reconsider the morality of total war. Eyewitness accounts underscore the horror. Survivors describe the sky turning red as phosphorus bombs ignited. Entire families suffocated in shelters as oxygen vanished, and rivers clogged with corpses as civilians sought escape from the flames. These testimonies, preserved in post-war German records, confirm that Dresden was not merely destroyed, it was erased. Yet in official Allied communications, the raid was presented as routine. Publicly, the justification was that Dresden was a transportation hub, a legitimate military target. Privately, the directive reveals the true target was not the railways, but the Soviet mind. The cover-up extended well beyond the war. For years, requests to release full cabinet records on Operation Thunderclap extension were denied on grounds of national security. Even today, portions of the Churchill memorandum remain redacted, the black ink concealing passages that may never see daylight. Historians who pressed for full disclosure faced resistance, accused of undermining wartime unity. The truth was never convenient, so it remained buried. Yet fragments survive, scattered across archives, testimonies, and intelligence intercepts. Together they reveal a chilling calculus: that Dresden's destruction was less about defeating the enemy than about shaping the post-war world. It was a signal written not in ink but in fire, a message directed across the Elbe to Stalin's armies, warning of the devastation that Western bombers could unleash. It was the birth of nuclear diplomacy before the bomb itself existed, a reminder that cities could be annihilated at will. Today, the ruins of Dresden have been rebuilt, its skyline restored, its cathedrals resurrected from rubble. But the shadows remain. The true reasons for its destruction lie not in German aggression, but in Allied ambition. Churchill's lost directive, hidden for decades, exposes the uncomfortable truth that victory was not only about defeating Hitler, but also about shaping the balance of power for the world that followed. The price was a city consumed in flames, sacrificed not for necessity, but for message. And that message still echoes, a warning written in the ruins of a city that never needed to burn. Chapter 4: The Tokyo Prisoner Exchange Conspiracy. In the sprawling port city of Tokyo, hidden behind layers of wartime censorship and propaganda, a secret negotiation unfolded that defied all public record. Known internally within the Japanese Imperial Army as Operation Umikami, the plan aimed to exchange Allied prisoners of war for technological blueprints acquired by Nazi Germany. The project's existence remained classified for decades, buried deep within Japanese military archives and obscured by the fog of war. What emerges from declassified files, intercepted naval signals, and eyewitness testimonies is a story of human lives treated as commodities, of covert alliances forged between two Axis powers on the brink of defeat, and of the complex interplay of desperation, secrecy, and ambition that defined the war's final years. The initial concept arose in mid-1944, as Japan faced mounting losses across the Pacific, and Germany began experiencing severe setbacks on the eastern and western fronts. High-ranking officers in the Imperial Japanese Army, notably General Shunroku Hata and Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, proposed a scheme to leverage captured Allied personnel for access to advanced German technologies. These included jet propulsion schematics, V-2 rocket plans, and encrypted communications protocols, assets that could potentially tilt the balance of Japan's defensive capabilities in the final months of the war. The plan, initially recorded under the cryptic designation Umikami in the Imperial Army General Staff files, called for a series of U-boat deliveries from Europe to the Japanese-controlled territories in Southeast Asia. Decrypted Allied intelligence, preserved in Station Hypo archives, captured fragments of communications regarding the project. Signals indicated that U-boats were scheduled to reach ports in Singapore and Penang, carrying crates labeled as scientific instruments, and occasionally human assets under armed escort. The terminology was deliberately vague, masking the true nature of the cargo, prisoners intended for exchange. Japanese and German officers coordinated via secure channels, often using pseudonyms and cover organizations to obscure the operational details. One Abwehr document, recovered in Berlin after the war, notes, a convoy carrying living cargo to the east will arrive under U-Boat 234. Deliverables include persons of strategic value. The logistics were perilous. POW transport ships were vulnerable to Allied naval patrols, and several never reached their destinations. Some disappeared entirely, leaving no survivors or records, their fates unaccounted for in both Allied and Axis reports. The loss of these vessels was officially attributed to routine wartime hazards, but Gestapo and NKVD reports suggest a more complex picture. Deliberate obfuscation of exchanges, deliberate erasure of tracks, and in some cases, summary executions of prisoners to prevent intelligence leaks. One diary recovered from a Gestapo courier in Berlin refers to cargo of living hostages to be delivered at all costs, emphasizing the moral detachment of the operation's architects. In Tokyo, coordination centers were established in secrecy, hidden within existing military facilities, to avoid detection by the public or lower-ranking officers. Japanese intelligence officers, operating under the Foreign Bureau's 1st Division, maintained daily logs of incoming and outgoing shipments. One log, recently declassified in part, details the arrival of a U-boat convoy in late October 1944, carrying 50 American pilots previously captured in Burma. The pilots were to be held in secure compounds near Yokohama, while Japanese engineers facilitated the transfer of German schematics and technical manuals to key industrial ministries. These documents were intended to accelerate Japan's weapons development program, including experimental jet aircraft and guided munitions. The human cost of the operation was immense. Prisoners were confined in windowless warehouses, stripped of identity and often miscounted. Survival depended not on international law or Geneva protections, but on the value assigned to each individual by military planners. Testimonies recorded secretly by Allied reconnaissance teams after the war describe extreme neglect, starvation, and exposure to harsh conditions. In some cases, prisoners were used as intermediaries to validate the schematics, required to demonstrate the German equipment's function under duress, further blurring the line between science and cruelty. The ethical implications extend beyond the immediate victims. Operation Umikami demonstrates the extent to which Axis powers were willing to subordinate humanity to strategic calculation. The use of live prisoners as bargaining chips represents a deliberate inversion of wartime conventions, a clandestine policy intended to maximize technological advantage while minimizing operational transparency. These actions, while hidden from public record, were known to both the Japanese High Command and senior German officials, forming a network of complicity that crossed continents. Despite its secrecy, fragments of the operation became known to Allied intelligence. Reports sent from intercepted U-boat transmissions, coded in Enigma, hinted at unusual arrivals in Singapore and Penang. However, operational chaos, wartime losses, and the sheer complexity of multinational coordination prevented full comprehension. Even as US Navy analysts deciphered segments of the communications, no immediate action was possible without compromising broader intelligence objectives. By war's end, most records were destroyed deliberately, leaving only partial evidence to reconstruct the exchanges. Post-war investigations revealed the scale and complexity of Operation Umikami. Interrogations of Japanese officers, combined with captured German documents, confirmed that several hundred prisoners were involved in the program, exchanged or otherwise manipulated for technology transfers. While some survived the war, many remain unaccounted for, lost in the chaos of transportation, imprisonment, or execution. Investigators noted an unusual convergence of German expertise in Japanese military projects immediately following the war, corroborating the notion that the exchanges had tangible outcomes. The Tokyo prisoner exchange conspiracy also underscores the global reach of wartime clandestine operations. It demonstrates the ability of Axis powers to coordinate across vast distances, using subterfuge and secrecy to pursue strategic objectives at the cost of individual lives. It reflects the broader moral ambiguities of war, that human beings could be treated as currency, traded for technological gain, and erased from history if inconvenient. Even decades later, researchers struggle to piece together the full narrative, hindered by missing files, redacted archives, and the deliberate silences of governments invested in suppressing inconvenient truths. Operation Umikami remains a chilling testament to the lengths nations will go to secure advantage in war. Its traces survive in scattered intelligence cables, recovered diaries, survivor testimonies, and partial naval logs. Together, These fragments tell a story of calculated exploitation, human sacrifice, and international complicity. The consequences of these actions extended far beyond the Pacific theater, influencing post-war military developments and shaping the complex ethical landscape that historians continue to navigate today. In Tokyo, the shadows of Umikami linger. Silent warehouses, vanished prisoners, and smuggled schematics remain a stark reminder that war's hidden truths often carry the heaviest burdens, borne by those whose voices history tried to silence. As we close the pages of these suppressed histories, we are left with an uneasy awareness that the Second World War's official narratives capture only the surface of events. Beneath the widely taught battles, treaties, and victory parades lie currents of clandestine operations, secret pacts, and human transactions too dangerous, too politically inconvenient, or too morally troubling to enter public record. From Madrid's shadowed corridors where Nazi officials secured their survival, to the irradiated expanses of the Urals where the Soviets flirted with catastrophic technologies, from Dresden's firestorm as a geopolitical message to the world, to Tokyo's clandestine prisoner exchanges for weapons secrets, the war's hidden dimensions reveal a reality far darker than textbooks acknowledge. Each revelation raises questions that history has deliberately left unanswered. How many lives were sacrificed not to defeat an enemy, but to send a warning? How many scientific experiments, ethical boundaries, and human rights were quietly obliterated for strategic advantage? The survivors, witnesses, and remnants of these operations often vanished into obscurity, their testimonies scattered, their suffering unrecorded. Yet the evidence persists in fragments, archival documents, intercepted communications, redacted files, and physical remnants of clandestine sites, waiting to be pieced together by historians and investigators brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths. As modern audiences grapple with the moral and political ramifications of these hidden stories, one fact becomes undeniable. War is rarely clean, rarely just, and rarely fully knowable. Its true dimensions are often hidden in shadows, and the past continues to whisper secrets that may forever challenge our understanding of humanity, power, and the costs of survival.